Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb. We are pleased to kick things off with a little roundtable about all things Trump and Minnesota. We're welcoming back John Rouleau to the podcast. John is a longtime GOP strategist and operative here in Minnesota. He currently serves as the executive director of the Minnesota Jobs Coalition. We are also joined today for the first time by Kip Christenson. Kip has been an activist and political operative with the Republican Party and campaigns up and down the ballot over the years. In 2020, he led various coalitions for the Trump campaign in Minnesota. With John and Kip, we will discuss recent polling in Minnesota and if Trump really has a path to victory here. And we will break down how Trump's visit this week will benefit the state party and local Republican candidates. We will end today by breaking down a recent commencement speech by NFL kicker Harrison Butker that has us both in a bit of an uproar. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the show.
We are excited to have yet another conversation about the 2024 presidential campaign and race. We have President Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, coming here to Minnesota this week, just in a couple days. And so we are excited to have Kip and John with us today to discuss all things Trump, if he can win, his path, what things are looking like, and what we're hearing. So, Kip, I want to start with you. We haven't had you on the podcast yet, so I want to get a little bit of insight on what your thoughts are on President Donald Trump coming to Minnesota and once again believing that and having part of his strategy that Minnesota is in play in 2024.
Sure. Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Michael, as well. This is a really big deal and a massive get for Whip Emmer, for the party, for the state of Minnesota to get President Trump here at this time. Obviously, the language going around is that Minnesota's in play. I think there's some really interesting polling that has shifted significantly in the last couple of months that gives some evidence behind that. And then on top of that, there are a lot of other esoteric factors that I think that we can point to that make that a credible argument going forward. We can get into that over time, but this coming right now in May is a really big deal, both in terms of the attention that it draws, the money that it brings, as well as the kind of breaking of narratives that it's going to propagate.
John, we just saw a KSTP poll come out that has neck and neck, Biden 44, Trump 42. KSTP also did a similar poll a year ago, same results. What's your thought of this being? Are you seeing and feeling it really be that close? And do you think there is a shot for and path for President Donald Trump to take Minnesota?
I think we've seen a number of these polls that have Trump within spitting distance in Minnesota. And the interesting thing to me is that they all seem to have Biden and Trump down in the low 40s, which feels about right if you have conversations with everyday Minnesotans. But there's a not insignificant chunk of the electorate that really isn't sure what they're going to do in this election. That they may have been third-party voters in 2016. Maybe they were Trump curious. In 2020, he solidified his support a little bit and improved his numbers. But a lot of that kind of third-party support shifted and was more of an anti-Trump vote in 2020. I think we're back to a place where a lot of those voters are trying to decide, do they care more about mean tweets or do they care more about the fact that inflation remains out of control? It's stubbornly high and we're not moving in the right direction, that the economy isn't working for everyone, and that Joe Biden's promises that it would be a return to normalcy, that it would be everything would be hunky-dory and everyone would get along really hasn't come to fruition. We're seeing an America that is weakened on the global stage, where our allies are beginning to wonder if we're going to be there to have their backs. And we're seeing a border that remains completely out of control, with migrants flooding across the border into our country, all-time record high border encounters. It's having a real cost and taking a real toll on the cities that are seeing those migrants arrive in their communities. And I think there's a lot of people who are trying to decide, are the mean tweets worth it? Are the rantings and ravings about stolen elections worth it? And that's a real consideration for people as they try to make these decisions. So I'm not surprised that there's a large number of undecideds, but that kind of seems to be that they both have their base there. And now it's a race for who can get the 20% of disaffected, disillusioned, really undecided voters.
I did not vote for Trump in 16 or 20. He will not get my vote this time around. But I do want to see Republicans succeed in the state. My question to you is, how does Trump coming to Minnesota help Republicans overall in this state? Question for both of you or all three of you.
I can jump in on that, and I will say that one of the things that I was most surprised about when I saw the invitation to the Lincoln Reagan dinner and the forms on that are the disclaimers that it is a fundraiser for the Republican Party of Minnesota. And really, it breaks a lot of narratives about Donald
Yep.
Trump that he's completely self interested. This money is not going to Donald Trump. This is not going to a JFC. The first $10,000 goes to the state party's federal account. The remaining dollars that are raised above and beyond that are going to the Republican Party of Minnesota's state account. This has a chance to probably be the largest grossing Lincoln Reagan dinner in state history for the Republicans in Minnesota, and it is a huge coup by David Hann and Whip Emmer to pull this off. So, regardless of whether or not Trump is in the news and are Republicans going to get bashed for going to a fundraiser with him, this is a lot of money that's going into a state party that direly needs it.
You're absolutely correct. Kip,
Yeah, as someone who's served extensively on the candidate side, at the local party side, at the state party side, and also on the IE side, this, John said it perfectly, this influx of money into the state party, which can be the funding vehicle across all of that and can deploy resources where it has a comparative advantage, and Becky, this is a former executive director, very well. This is a game changer
yep.
for getting momentum inside the actual party vehicle. And then there are a significant number of other changes that have occurred recently federally that have really freed up the ability for soft dollars to play extensively with a recent FEC advisory opinion to go alongside the hard dollars on the candidate side, alongside what can be done with 501c4s and other outside organizations. All of these pieces come together, to your point, in a very unified package that really has shifted the landscape, shifted the foundation of how we can prosecute this campaign effectively with President Trump at the top of the ticket, yes, but also for all of the other races across the state and federal. As John said, a lot of the money coming from this fundraiser is flowing into the state account. It's excess funds above that federal, and we're gonna pretty quickly here exhaust any federal debt that has encumbered the party over the past. And there's a lot of momentum happening here on the party side. For the candidates, this is a real coup. It frees up caucus money to do what's really necessary for the House candidates inside their districts. And we don't have to worry quite as much as we have in very recent history about where we're going to spend the necessary resources and at the right time, because I think the right pipelines are getting filled.
One of the points that I've raised is that Trump is the nominee, that he will there will be the inability, not much of a team player, and that there's going to be an effective where he just drowns out the other candidates, and it's difficult for them to get visibility. The presentation and how this event is occurring in Minnesota really undermines that point that I made because it's very collaborative. It's helpful to the party. And having listened to me say that for so long, I'm really in agreement with what John and Kip are saying as to how value added and much of a team atmosphere this event on Friday is happening, is occurring. And it also does undermine a point that I've made, which is that Trump is all about himself. He's not going to work in a collaborative way. And that's blowing up. My point is blowing up in a pretty significant way because as those two gentlemen just articulated, this is a real team event on Friday.
That is very humble of you to admit, but I agree with what you said and what these gentlemen have also shared. This event aside, all Republicans up and down the ballot are going to be tied to former Donald Trump. That's going to be something the Democrats are going to use, regardless if he steps foot in the state, regardless if he mentions any candidate, or Minnesota as a whole, right? That's going to be a strategy. So with him coming here, tickets are start at $500, range up to $100,000 for a VIP table. This is a huge boost to the efforts of what the Republican Party of Minnesota is going to be able to do with mailers, with events, with digital text messages, with surveys and polling, with everything across the board of moving that needle. Because as we talked about we've had conversations about how close the legislative race is. 12 votes here, 4 votes here would have flipped what our legislative makeup looks like this cycle. And so with the House on the ballot, it's really imperative that we do pick up 2, 4, 6 votes across the board. Is it going to flip for Donald Trump? That's yet to be seen. But I do think with having these extra dollars in play to be able to hit more households, communicate with more voters, exactly what John said, reiterating where we were 4 years ago and what the price of gas is now, what the price of eggs are, what our mortgage interest rates are, all of these things that people know and feel, but reminding them that it's happened under the charge of Joe Biden and the Democrats. And it really is. Again, I don't know where I'm going to cast my vote this year. I voted for Trump in 16, not in 16. I did vote for him in 20. So my vote is I'm one of those undecideds here yet in the middle of May. But when we look down ballot, which I know we've been critical about before, we thought that it might be a hindrance having President Donald Trump at the top of the ballot. This really has the opportunity to give us the resources to make those down ballot races closer, close that gap, and flip some of those seats that we really need to do to make sure we don't have a single party rule going into 2025.
And I will just say that part of the reason I wanted to have this episode, and I'm so appreciative that Kip was able to join us and John, is because one of the discussion points that I've raised when we were doing analysis on earlier in the presidential cycle in terms of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Iowa and the other states, and John was offering his analysis about where the race was shaping up. One of the questions I posed to him is, if Trump is on the ticket, if he's the nominee, how does he help Republicans win in Minnesota? And John offered, I think, a very clear answer on this. And so to hear Kip and John both articulate, I think in very understandable terms for our listeners, how this is a team effort and Trump coming here to Minnesota is value added to the entire Republican team, I think it's a really good message, and it's a good pushback on some of the narrative that I've offered in the past, which is that I thought Trump would bigfoot into these states and he wouldn't be much of a team player. And that's not showing itself out in Minnesota. And I'm glad we're getting some clarity on that from all three of you on why I was wrong in my points earlier in the year.
Kip, I want to start with you on this. To what Michael just said, with seeing this kind of team player Trump, what do you think has changed? We look at Donald Trump as this esoteric, very selfish kind of gentleman. I don't necessarily know that's been the case. I know that he obviously does travel around. He campaigns for himself. He brings up other candidates and party chairs and that all across the country. But why do you think that this is something that we are seeing maybe a little bit more of now? Do you think there is a mindset change? Do you think he recognizes that he does want to work cohesively? Or is this just a one-off here and there and we're still going to see the rallies where it's all Donald Trump, all the time?
I'd like to push back against the narrative as you've laid it out. Well, Michael here, and frankly, the media broadly. This all Donald Trump, all for himself. That just simply wasn't the case. That wasn't the case in 2020. Working on the campaign, we were elevating candidates all across the map. In 2018, Trump championed candidates across this country in House races in the off-cycle election, traveled a whirlwind tour to elevate people who were not him, and those were not purely selfish things that he wanted other people to compose a majority and be loyal to him. Loyalty, obviously, he brings that up from time to time, but there's and everybody's to think that there's a self-interest there. Sure, there's a governing interest there. You need to have a governing coalition to succeed. And so when we were here in Minnesota in 2020, he shared the stage and elevated candidates consistently at the congressional level, even down to the local level, on any of his stops in this state. Down in Georgia, my gosh, the resources that were dumped after he got beaten, the resources that were dumped into Georgia to try to save Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue by the Trump campaign through the RNC were absolutely Herculean. And then you continue this effort through 2022. The same has been said, despite all of the fights that he's been waging on a personal front against the weaponized judiciary by law enforcement, which is turning out to be a series of duds. And the people are starting to see this. The left has forced a narrative that has divided Americans, not only against each other, but against what we see with our own eyes. And that narrative is starting to break. Whether it's the narrative of a selfish Donald Trump in a political landscape, or whether it's the endless stream of narratives that are starting to fall apart before our very eyes, people are starting to wake up, as you said, Becky, on inflation, on economics, on pocketbook issues, on safe streets, on ongoing Democrat failures, on the fragmentation of the DFL's out of control far left wing of its caucus that currently has the DFL caucus captive to its far progressive ideology. These things cannot be hidden by the media machine anymore. And people are starting to wake up, and you're seeing it in the polls, and you're certainly seeing it in the national polling and what's happening nationwide. Now, Minnesota is a hard place. Minnesota is incomparably a difficult territory to win as a Republican for president, historically so. That you're fighting for a state that we've struggled to gain 50% for my entire lifetime on statewide tickets as Republicans. However, he's choosing to fight here. And I take great encouragement in that. And he's not fighting just for himself, as we've already said. He's fighting for what's possible in this state.
John, I want to go to you and just hit on messaging a little bit. So, we know that with Trump's way of speaking, he gets a lot of news, everything that he says. When he comes to Minnesota, and just as we see him on the campaign trail going forward a little bit, what do we need from him to help sway some of those folks like me that were maybe on board at one time, a little undecided, or just as you talked about a little bit before, those folks, a large swath of the population, maybe not a large swath, but consistently 9 to 11% that kind of sit there in the middle. What do you think he needs to do, or what do we need to hear from him to sway them, to bring them over to his side, to our side?
I think one of the most difficult things that you encounter when you're working in the orbit of Donald Trump is you have a candidate and an individual who is very receptive to the positive kind of feedback loop that he gets from his hardcore supporters, from his base, the people who flood these rallies whenever he speaks. And the biggest applause lines that he gets from there oftentimes are the things that turn off those voters like you. And it's this fine line that he has to walk between wanting to keep his base energized and to make that outreach to the more, I would say, the more undecided voters. One of the things that a lot of people make the mistake in believing is that kind of moderate, middle of the road voter is a moderate on every issue. We hear about the moderates in the middle. And the reality is that people aren't quite that simple. Some of them might hold moderate views on an issue or two, or some of them, but it's equally likely that they hold competing views that aren't necessarily moderate on those issues. And what we need to see from Donald Trump is a focus on those issues that resonate across the board. There's certainly things that he can say to his base that will rile them up, but will appeal to the voters who he needs to win back in order to get up to the place that he is. And if you look historically in Minnesota, a Republican is usually pretty much good for 44 to 45% statewide. That just is what it is. It's been that way going back to Tim Pawlenty. If you look at Jeff Johnson's numbers, if you look at Donald Trump's numbers, if you look at all of those numbers across the board, 44, 45%. The question is, what happens with Joe Biden? Hillary Clinton was in kind of that 46.5, 47%. Joe Biden was up over 50%. And what I'm waiting to see is, where does that batch of voters go? What do they look like? But I think that's always the hardest thing, right? Is what do you focus on? And I would say economy, crime, immigration. Those are three things that he can very easily talk about without alienating kind of that 15-20% that are stuck in the middle. If he starts to branch out into kind of more of those base red meat issues that he's accustomed to speaking about when he's in front of his base, that's where you start to see it. But campaigns are long. He's got a big microphone, but they're also won in TV points and direct mail pieces and digital ads. And he has a team of professionals around him who are working to craft those messages and make sure that the people in the middle are hearing what they need to hear, especially with so many people just tuning politics out and being burnt out after the last 10, 11 years of what this is going on. So I think finding a way to talk to those voters who have tuned the process out is really going to be the key.
Kip, before we wrap here, Donald Trump famously said in 2020, if he doesn't win Minnesota, he's not coming back. He obviously is coming back. Do you think this is the last we're going to see, or do you think we're gonna see him once, twice, half dozen more times between now and November?
I was actually there when he said that. I remember that moment quite well. I think that Ken Martin is having a little bit of fun time that quote and saying, "Here's yet another broken promise." That's just simply not the case. It was a joke. He's here. He's coming back. And I think that the campaign, in either hard dollars, soft dollars, some combination of that, is very much going to be deployed here in Minnesota, probably with a couple of visits. Certainly, there's dual purpose in coming to Minnesota, regardless of what the polling or actual success in Minnesota has from a purely strategic standpoint. If you're going to deploy assets into Western Wisconsin, it happens through the Minneapolis DMA. If you're going to attract rural Wisconsin voters, a lot of that happens near here as well. And so with Wisconsin entirely as competitive as it is, with 20% of black voters in Milwaukee polling for Trump at this time, that doesn't just stop at the St. Croix River. There's not an imaginary border where that happens. We're talking not only about breaking other narratives, Becky, here, but there's uncommon coalitions that this campaign, in a completely asymmetric warfare type of way, can deploy into Hennepin and Ramsey County to target populations that the DFL is losing left and right, whether it's winnable Somalis, whether it's the Karen, whether it's these other coalitions. And that's going to happen. And I think he's going to deploy those assets, whether that's in person or just campaign assets, is yet to be seen.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for coming on, and we're going to do this again. We're going to try to do it as this election goes forward. We're going to want to bring in people who can offer some who can give some analysis on my takes in particular about the race for president. It's good to have some smart people adding some analysis and commentary to the discussion, and we appreciate you guys coming on. John, where can people follow you on social media, and Kip, the same for you?
They can follow me on Twitter for my rare tweets at John_Rouleau.
And as well on Twitter for probably even more rare tweets and sometimes just healthy sarcasm, Kip_MN.
Thank you both for joining us today and offering your analysis and your take and offering some good, responsible pushback on where I was wrong previously. I appreciate that. Becky, we just interviewed Kip Christenson and John Rouleau to offer perspective and analysis on former President Trump's visit to Minnesota and whether whether Minnesota in play or not, really, for the Trump campaign. Your take?
Yeah, I always think it's interesting to have here in this situation. Kip has been on working directly for President Donald Trump's campaign and efforts here in Minnesota. John has long worked for down ballot tickets, working to win the majorities in the House and the Senate and on that level too. So to get the perspective of folks that have been or are currently on the ground, hearing and seeing how this plays, I think, is a great thing to have because you and I are no longer on the ground in these roles. And so it's a good perspective to bring to the table. And so very appreciative of that. And I think obviously it's the big race of the year, right? We're going to be talking about this quite a bit going forward. And so to really get the perspective of folks who are talking to the voters, who are talking to the candidates and what they think and feel is huge.
It's a balance for me because I'm not a Trump guy. And I'm not going to be a Trump guy this election cycle, but I simultaneously want Republicans to succeed and do a better job. So hearing how he's threading this type of needle in terms of the support for the party, this is a big coup for the party. And I think John and Kip laid it out from operationally. And then you added too how this benefits the entire Republican team, which I think is good. It's going to be interesting conversation because again, we're doing a podcast that breaks down politics. This is going to be the marquee presidential race. And so it's important that we have people on the podcast who can offer some analysis and perspective that are purely in kind of that Trump world. And it was good to get that analysis and its perspectives that we're going to have to continue to have a discussion on. But I really do think this is a real pivot opportunity for the Trump campaign, particularly in Minnesota. And as I've told some media outlets just this week, I believe Minnesota is in play because the Democrats are invested in here. They've invested in Minnesota. President Biden has come a few times. The Vice President Kamala Harris has come. The First Lady has come, and now former President Trump is coming this Friday for a big event with the Republican Party in Minnesota. It's clear that both sides view Minnesota in play. And we'll see how this race shapes out. But I was really appreciative for the discussion. And thank you, of course, not rubbing it in too much related to my wrong takes about Trump previously. You were kind, you were generous today.
Hey, I don't necessarily think they were wrong takes. I think things have just evolved significantly since we've started talking about this. And so
Yes.
I think that in the next 6, 7 months, we're also going to see that continued evolution. And so I'm excited to continue to talk and see how this shapes up. And one thing I did want to hit on in the same KSTP poll that we mentioned that came out just this week, they asked registered and likely voters who they were polling for those who say they support Trump if their support would shift away from him if he was found guilty in this hush money case that is dominating the news right now. 88% said they would still vote for Trump. 0% said they would shift to Biden, and only 5% said they would consider shifting to another candidate. Does the 88% surprise you? Did you expect it higher or lower?
The 88% does surprise me. It does not surprise me. It surprises me only that it's that low. Only that it's that low. I
Interesting.
expected it to be. So from that standpoint, I think the cake is baked in regards to Trump. There's really not much more content or material you need to find out in order to make a decision. I think his support is strong and unwavering. And I think the poll results reflect that. I think ultimately it comes down to the margins. And having reviewed the poll and then watched the coverage, when you get into the 5% would consider shifting to another candidate, when you're talking about a presidential race that Trump lost in Minnesota by 45,000 votes or 1.5%, when you have 5% of people willing to consider going to another candidate, that could truly impact it. So to say that a conviction for Trump doesn't hurt him, it doesn't hurt him in, I think, the larger context. But when you get down to some of these individual states, and in terms of it in Minnesota, him losing 4 to 5% of his support because of a conviction, if it works out that way, I don't want to be overly simplistic, but that could really impact a very close race here in Minnesota. And so it's something to watch.
Absolutely. My take on that is these are folks that I think we've seen over the years that people like to lie to pollsters, right? We've seen that they don't always tell the truth. I think that some folks here like to think that they have a moral high ground and have a moral compass that they get asked on the phone, if he's convicted of this big deal here, are you still going to support them? And whoa, nope, that's my line. I'd consider shifting somewhere else, but not to Biden. So you've got Robert Kennedy as your person here, right? I don't know that it's really going to be that high. I think you're right. I think the 88% sounds low. I believe it's going to be higher. I don't know that 5% are really going to shift, but what do we know? I think your take is spot on, though, that if it is 5%, that is the win or the loss right there. I do think it's going to be, the margin is going to be smaller than it was in 2020. I think it's going to be within 3-4% here. One other thing I did want to mention, so this Lincoln Reagan dinner that he is coming to for the Republican Party of Minnesota is right along with the MNGOP state convention this weekend. So we have State Central on the 16th, the state convention on the 17th and 18th. Not as much, I guess there's still a decent amount of business that's being conducted. They are going to nominate the presidential electors. They will nominate the state at large national delegates and alternates. And then they are also going to be doing a U.S. Senate endorsement. I embarrassingly don't know how many candidates are even up for the endorsement right now. I think 2. Is it just the 2 gentlemen that are running for the endorsement?
There are 4 candidates listed on the
Hmm.
party website. I think Joe Frazier is the front runner to get the endorsement this weekend, and we'll see what happens. Will you be going to the convention?
I will not be going to the convention.
I will be at a baseball field somewhere watching athletics, but I will not be at the convention. But I'll be watching it, monitoring it closely on social media, see what happens. And again, we'll see what the president does when he's here.
I'm excited to hear all about his speech.
That's right.
All right, moving on. Speaking of speeches, ooh, look at this
Nice
segue. I didn't even
job.
plan that one.
That's really good.
Yes. So this last weekend, a speech from Harrison Butker, who is a new name for me, maybe less so for maybe you are a little bit more familiar, being a little bit more into the whole football world than I can say that I am. He is the kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs. He gave a commencement speech, and whew, this really rubbed me the wrong way. So I'm going to read the part that rubbed me the wrong way. So bear with me as I get through this. I think it is you, the women, who have had the most diabolical lies to you. Some of you may go on to lead successful careers in the world, but I would venture to guess that the majority of you are most excited about your marriage and the children you will bring into this world. I can tell you that my beautiful wife, Isabel, would be the first to say that her life truly started when she became living her vocation as a wife and mother. I am on the stage and able to be the man I am because I have a wife who leans into her vocation. I am beyond blessed with many talents God has given me, but it cannot be overstated that all of my success is made possible because a girl I met in band class, he tears up very adorably, one would think, back in middle school, could convert to the faith, become my wife, and embrace one of the most important titles of all, homemaker. And he really kicked this off by saying, you ladies are probably sitting here at graduation, thinking about your promotions and your careers, but you've been told lies. Oof. Now, let me start by saying the best and most rewarding thing, and the thing I'm most proud of in my life, is being a wife and mother. I totally get that. However, it just irks me. Here are women and men there, but he was speaking to the women who have spent the last 4 years educating themselves, working towards a degree so that they can go out in the working world. Are some of those women potentially looking, maybe don't go out in the working world. Maybe they do become a wife and mother immediately after graduation, and that's their prerogative. But the concept that he is talking to this class of educated women who are looking and striving for what their life is going to be, what their career is going to look like, and saying to them, y'all are stupid. The most important vocation is a wife and mother. I feel like it just completely disregards all of their efforts, all of what they're sitting there, and just really makes me sad for what these young girls, I was in college almost 20 years ago. These are young women who have their entire lives ahead of them. And I feel like being poo-pooed on the fact that they want to go out and be successful in whatever it is, whether it's they want to be a kindergarten teacher or they want to be a CEO or everything in between. That's an important vocation. They should be able to do that, and they should be applauded for wanting to go out and contribute to their career, to their future success in that way. And oh my gosh, it felt like an SNL skit. It felt like something that I had to watch it on a couple different places just to see that this was an actual true thing that a man was saying to women at a graduation ceremony. You have young women in your family. You have 2 young daughters. What's your take on this?
It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. It is back. It's just a horrible commentary for a commencement speech in any context. I think it's a bad speech, but a commencement speech, it's a bad message, but particularly a bad message at a commencement address, because it seems as if he's going up there and saying, if you're a woman in this crowd, you're a woman in this crowd and you've pursued an academic career and you've graduated now, the best thing you can do is basically rip up your diploma and go back home and go home and be subservient to your husband. That just blows my mind. That someone would get up at a commencement address and say that. Now, I would not be supportive of that message being delivered in any venue, but I'm really trying to focus here on the commencement address aspect of this,
Mhm.
because that's, I think, was a double whammy in terms of the speech, because I don't think that's a good message to give to someone, but it certainly isn't at a commencement address when it's such a moment of accomplishment and something that should be celebrated. To have someone come into the venue and to talk down to women and in essence say you've been lied to, in essence you've been conned, and in essence the existence of them being there on stage, he's almost poo-pooing them and saying you shouldn't be here today.
Right.
It just blows my mind why someone would think of doing that. And in that type of venue, achieving a college degree and being in that type of moment, that is a moment you're not going to get back. And for someone to come in with that type of message to a class, a graduation class in any capacity, if it was just a male school, it would be an inappropriate
Right.
message. But with women sitting there in the audience, and I will say to you, and it is something that I am so concerned about with my daughters, and so concerned about with my daughters is their mental health, their ability to feel good about themselves. That's why I'm so concerned about social media. I limit their use of social media. We talk about social media, not and I talk to them, and one of the things my wife and I both do is to teach them to advocate for themselves and to be strong and to advocate. And I've had to explain to my children, to my daughters in particular, advocate means standing up. If you think I'm wrong, speak up and say that I'm wrong. And advocate doesn't mean going along with things and being and pushing back on stuff. And boy, oh boy, have my daughters taken that to heart, because they've pushed back on me when we're discussing politics or other things and they disagree. This is backwards thinking. This is the type of repressive thinking that I absolutely do not believe is appropriate. And I will say, this would not be something that a conversation that I think would ever necessarily happen with a man. Has anyone ever said to me, and I'll just speak to myself for a second, I don't think anyone's ever said to me at any point in my life, how do you balance your being a dad with your career? That's never something that I've ever had that expectation of. But still, in 2024, there is still that implied expectation that if a woman has a career, that it needs to be balanced with taking care of children and being a homemaker or being supportive or having those types of household duties. And I think it's just backwards thinking. Do I believe that in my particular circumstance, do I believe that my wife and I being at home together, parenting our kids works for us? Absolutely, it does. Does it work for everyone? No, it doesn't. Are there situations where a woman can choose to be a CEO or anything in life? And should she be judged by what she's not doing? I think women have that additional expectation on them. And I think it's so disappointing. And I want my daughters to be whatever they want to be in life. But they can be, it's just funny you mentioned that. I was talking to them. My daughters might be embarrassed that I'm bringing this up, but I'm going to bring it up anyways. My daughters were taking an AP test this week for math. They were explaining to me how they're working towards this test and they're the kind of the layout of their test. And we were driving back to the house and I leaned over I paused for a moment. I leaned back and I said, you two kids are so fucking smart. You two kids are so fucking smart. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't do anything in life. I can't even begin to comprehend the test you're taking. You two kids are so fucking smart. Don't ever let anyone tell you you can't be anything. Now, that being said, you probably aren't going to be in the NBA because you're not that tall. But aside from that, don't let anyone ever tell you that you can't be anything that you want. And aside from maybe being in the NBA, there's nothing you can't do. And that's the type of message I think girls, young women should be hearing. They can be anything they want. And to sit there and stand up at a graduation ceremony is just astounding and appalling to me. I'm probably
Absolutely.
going to bleep out the F words. And that was the moment where I wanted my daughters to know they can be fucking anything they want in life. And when they're describing me a test that they're taking that I couldn't even comprehend how they're taking it and they're doing as well as they are academically, they don't need a man telling them anything else other than do what you want to do in life, be what you want to be, and you're going to be great at it. And don't allow people to shut you out and limit what you do. And that dumb son of a bitch, when he gave that commencement speech, was delivering that message both to the women in the audience and when it was broadcast out. And it's just shameful.
And I think it also perpetuates this conversation and allowing younger men to think that kind of conversation and that way of thinking is okay. I am very grateful for my parents and support system for allowing me to dive headfirst into my career, to jump around and quit a job for a job that is 90 days because I thought it was going to further my career working on a campaign, going out to Washington, D.C., where the sky is truly the limits of what you want to do in the political world. That was something I wanted to work hard and I wanted to do that because I knew that I always wanted to be a wife and mother, and I knew that was going to be on my agenda. And I'm so grateful I had the opportunity for more than a decade to work and live my dream and then come home. And now I'm able to, like you said, balance that out. And I have a husband who Joe says all the time, if I had a job and a salary that allowed for it, he would be happy to be a stay-at-home dad. And I want to make sure too that this is not at all speaking negatively at anybody who decides to be a stay-at-home parent. More power to you. That is an incredible job and undertaking. But again, these are young folks who have their entire life and career ahead of them, who are looking to forward to building on what that is going to be in 1 year and 5 year, what their 10-year plan is going to look like. And if that includes being a homemaker, that is their prerogative and their choice. But it is just an incredible way. It reminds me, one of my favorite movies is Mona Lisa Smile, and it's about Wesleyan College for women and how it's just a preparatory school for homemakers. It literally feels like we're going back to the 50s of this kind of way of thinking. And it's wild to me that it was real. And there's a change.org petition to get him fired from the Chiefs. And there's a lot of backlash. We haven't seen anything from the Chiefs responding to this, or Butker also. He said other inflammatory things against the LGBTQ community as well, calling them living deadly sins, essentially. It was, I guess it's crazy to me that in 2024, speakers are brought forward that obviously he has tweeted these things and similar things in the past. But do they not vet? Do they not say, hey, hand over your speech. We want to review this? It It's just pretty insane and really disappointing. And I hope all those women understand how great their future can be if they want to have a 9 to 5, if they want to stay at home, if they want to work part-time, or if they want to take the role of some folks like myself who sometimes, work for 5 years, 18-hour days jobs and working on call all the time. You can do, like you said, you can do whatever you want to do. And that's the joys of living in 2024 as a woman, that we have that capacity. And it's so unfortunate that these kind of things and this way of thinking still exists. And it blows my mind.
I'm glad you wanted to discuss this subject because I think it's important that we discuss these issues. And it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating because I think it just continues to perpetuate a narrative. Particularly, I mean, I will just have to say to you that I don't understand what the target audience is. The internet's on the computer. This was going to get out. And to think that this was now, I absolutely believe that there are families out there right now there are women and men and a whole collection of families, but let's just start in that dynamic for a second, of women and men who have those types of relationships where the woman chooses to stay at home and the man goes out to work in that type of old-fashioned somewhat model. That if that works for them, great. If that works for them, great. Okay. But to go there and to say that and to preach that, to go there and say that's the best way in which to do things, I absolutely believe, just on my personal level, that the dynamic of having two parents at home makes sense. It makes sense for my family, but it may not make sense for every family. There may be situations where having one parent in the home and having a situation where there's a spouse outside is a better dynamic. There's so many ways in which families can be raised, traditional, non-traditional ways that produce wonderful contributing members of society. And I think the less we lecture and tell people how it needs to be and be supportive of the way they're doing things, I think the better. What a horrible message. What a horrible message to deliver to women. And I hope I've talked about this speech with my daughters, and I told them, I said, if you ever are on the receiving message of someone sitting in front of you and preaching that, feel free to just walk up and leave.
Mhm.
I said, feel free to sit there and listen, feel free to walk away, but feel empowered to do whatever you want to do to communicate, either if that's sitting and listening or getting up and leaving. Advocating for yourself is so critically important. I teach it to my son. My wife and I are big advocates in teaching our kids to advocate. And advocate doesn't mean agreeing.
Mhm.
It's telling your dad, hey, I think you're wrong. Telling mom, I think you're wrong, but standing up and having their own choices. And this is just, it was so depressing. The other thing, can we just mention, he took a swipe at Taylor Swift.
Yes.
Okay, now, again, can we talk for just a second about the football dynamics? Can you explain that to our listeners? He took a shot at Taylor Swift. He's on the team.
Right.
You want to go through that for a second?
Yeah. So he quoted one of Taylor Swift's songs, and I think that he thought it would win some folks over, but he did it. It was obviously a swing. He's trying to bring in Taylor Swift is dating one of his teammates, and I don't know if he feels weird about that or what. But if we want to talk about one of the hardest working women who has had one of the most insanely successful careers, that that's Taylor Swift. This woman is working tirelessly, like her or hate her. You can't deny the fact that the amount of effort she puts into her songwriting and her music writing and her tours and every little Easter egg that she puts in there of like her show in Paris that was the 87th show, which is the number that her boyfriend wears. She came out wearing a red and yellow outfit in honor. It's just like bonkers. I know this is my word of this the podcast lately, but like every thought and effort she puts in this. And here's the deal: if you are going to, what's your audience of swinging at Taylor Swift, who is probably one of the most the most popular and well regarded person in the world?
Yes.
I just. Is he just looking for headlines? Is that really what it is? Is he trying to I don't know what he's looking for here, but I think he missed the mark.
So I saw the speech first, and then I figured out, wait, he's the kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs. And then I found out the part about the Taylor Swift, and it led me to believe that the speech was entirely designed to generate headlines
Yeah.
and to take a swing. And look who he's attempting to generate headlines on the back of the women who are in that audience. That's who the speech was delivered to, women who had graduated. That condescending message to them, and then he decides to take a swing at Taylor Swift.
Uh-huh.
Now, I've been clear about Taylor Swift. The only thing I'm frustrated with about Taylor Swift is she's living my dream. And she gets to go to stadiums and watch football games, and she gets to be on the field when her boyfriend wins the Super Bowl.
I thought maybe you were talking about your dreams of being in sequined attire dancing on stage.
Look, I got to tell you something. I had a boyfriend that was in the NFL. I'd want to make sure he won the Super Bowl, okay? But the point I'm saying is it's just a condescending.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is we're looking at this a little bit, and if we can for just a moment, we're looking at this also from the comms perspective. We discussed it from the standpoint of how you felt about it and the message from it, but from a comms perspective, from a PR perspective, this looks like a speech that was constructed to be like, okay, I'm going to construct a speech that's going to piss off as many people as possible, and let's deliver it. And what I'm frustrated with, Becky, is that when a lot of times that done, when people want to get headlines, how do they get headlines? They choose to get headlines on the backs of targeting people. And that's what I think is frustrating. He didn't go there and give a message talking about men. He talked about the role of men, but he gave the speech about what he expected women to do.
Right.
Not about men obligating their oath and men needing to stand up and treating women better and being more supportive of what they do. That is a message. I guarantee you that's a message I delivered to my son. And that's a message out there that needs to be delivered to a lot of men about how they treat women and how the relationships that they had with women. And as someone who has had to deliver that message and had it delivered to me, it's an important message that young men hear. I think right now that's a message that's more important to be delivered at a commencement address about young men being supportive and understanding and respectful of changing roles, particularly that women are having in this country, and being supportive of them rather than jumping on their backs.
Completely agree. Thanks for letting this be part of the show. think we both feel very strongly about it, and it just really blew my mind. I will be interested to see if we hear any statements from the Chiefs on this eventually. I would argue that we're 4 or 5 days past it now. If we haven't heard anything, they're gonna hope that something, practice camp or whatever, glosses over and it goes away soon. But
It's called training camp,
training camp, dang it.
not practice camp.
Man, I really just made myself sound very ignorant on football.
No, it's okay. Just be careful. But everyone knows you're ignorant on football because how you did in our fantasy league last year.
It's true. It's true.
Right?
Great time. Thanks for the good conversation. We will next week. Can't wait to hear about Trump's speech. And hopefully he does not take the Harrison Butker route of just doing things for headlines. And I'm cautiously optimistic that we get some good message points out of him that can help Minnesota Republicans.
Sounds good, Becky. Thanks for doing this.
Bye.
We want to thank you for listening to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can leave a review or give us a shout out on our website or across all social media platforms at BB Breakpod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Thank you again for listening.